There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. That's the quote widely attributed to Vladimir Lenin, and it's certainly been one of those weeks, or to be more precise, 12 days. That was the time since the start of the uprising led by Abu Muhammad al-Jalani in northern Syria and the fall of the Assad regime. To discuss a momentous few days and what comes next, I'm joined throughout tonight's show by lecturer in international relations at the University of Sussex and friend of the show, David Waring. Thank you so much for joining us, David.
No problem, Michael.
In the middle of the show as well, I got an interview with a Syrian academic living in the UK. Pretty powerful interview, so do stay tuned for that. Straight into it, the Assad dynasty stood for 50 years, but it fell in just 12 days. And after a lightning offensive through Aleppo, Hama and Homs, the Islamist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, along with other rebel organisations, took Damascus on Sunday. The BBC were the first Western news crew to reach Damascus. This was their correspondent reporting on the scenes of jubilation.
This is where people are celebrating in the central Umayyad Square. Civilians and rebels, you can hear the sound of celebratory gunfire. People are driving around in their cars. They're giving me peace signs. They're saying that life is going to be so much better now that Bashar Al Assad is gone. But there is a mix of joy and fear in the city. There are those who supported Bashar Al Assad, who felt they were protected by him, and now they're wondering what is going to happen.
Here, I spoke to people who have long been waiting for his downfall. Thank you, she says. The tyrant has fallen. The tyrant has fallen. Many of her family died under President Assad's rule, some in prison.
My cousin, my son, my family, all of them.
How are you feeling?
It's an indescribable feeling. We're so happy. After all the years of dictatorship we've lived through, we were in prison in 2014 and now we're out, thank God. We won because of our men and our fighters, and now we're at the moment that we're going to build the greatest Syria.
Those were very moving and jubilant statements from members of the public in central Damascus. But earlier in that clip, the reporter also made reference to concern among many Syrians. That, of course, makes lots of sense. Transitions after coups or revolutions, delete as appropriate, rarely go smoothly. And Syria's most powerful man is now a former affiliate of Al-Qaeda. Abu Muhammad al-Jalani is the head of HTS, seen here, getting a hero's welcome to an iconic mosque in central Damascus. Jalani was designated a terrorist by the United States in 2013, but has tried to portray a moderated image to Syrians and to the world. Speaking inside the mosque, Jalani described the victory as a turning point for the region, accusing Assad of having handed Syria over to Iranian ambitions while spreading sectarianism and corruption. Evidence of Assad's brutality has also been front and centre over the past 24 hours. These are scenes of hundreds of detainees being released from Sednaya prison. The prison was known locally as the Human Slaughterhouse. And according to Amnesty International, up to 20,000 prisoners were held there, mostly following sham trials. Survivors of the prison have recounted brutal daily beatings and torture by prison guards. Of course, the man responsible for that torture, Bashar Al Assad, has now fled to Moscow, where he's been granted political asylum. And we're going to talk through all aspects of what's gone on this weekend. David, to begin, this is a remarkable turn of events. I made the statement about weeks and decades in weeks, but this does seem to have been just phenomenally quick that this happened. And I don't really think anyone expected it. Why has this happened now?
Yeah, I was taken by surprise as well. And I suppose when you look at it more closely, you can see the logic of, the logic of the process. The reason that Bashar Al Assad's regime survived the civil war in the 2010s was fundamentally to do with outside support from the Iranians, support from Hezbollah. Syria was basically a land bridge between Iran and Lebanon, which allowed the Iranians to support Hezbollah and arm Hezbollah. So it was crucial for both of them, and they both came to Assad's aid. And the Russians came to Assad's aid as well. Russia has got two major military bases in the northwest of the country, a naval base and an air base, which is crucial to Russia's ability to project power outside of its country and into the Middle East, even into Africa. And so they all came to the regime's aid. And what's been happening in the past year or so, a couple of years, I mean, Russia is preoccupied with Ukraine. Hezbollah's been preoccupied with Israel, so has Iran. All of those external supporters have been severely weakened over the past year or two. And that in turn leaves Syria weaker, leaves the regime weaker. Not to mention the fact that the war itself left the regime significantly weaker. So, you can see how in hindsight, you can see how all it took was a concerted push by a more unified and committed and organised group of Syrian rebels. But, I mean, no one expected this a couple of weeks ago. Analysts, even on Friday, were saying they thought the regime would survive. And so, while we can look back and say, with hindsight, you can see how this happened, the reality was that people weren't expecting it. It did look like Assad had won the war and bottled up the rebels in northern Syria, but they've come back, and it's a big shock.
As you say, sort of with hindsight, it's clear why this has happened now, right? It's basically the international scene has changed. Russia, their biggest backer, distracted in Ukraine. I think Hezbollah, probably that's incredibly significant that Hezbollah has essentially been decapitated by the Israelis, and they were sort of on the ground, one of the strongest forces fighting on Assad's side, and then Iran, of course, having a difficult time. I suppose there's two different questions, though, isn't there? Why did this happen now? And we can see why Assad sort of, as you say, in hindsight, is in a weaker position than he was 2 years ago. But the fact it collapses in 12 days, and it seems like the military didn't put up even the smallest of fights. I mean, I suppose we saw a similar thing in Afghanistan, didn't we? Where sort of, a 20-year US occupation, the moment they go, I think most people in the West expected the Taliban to retake control, but analysts thought it would take sort of 9 months or something, so the Americans could kind of sort of forget about it by then. The fact it happened in 8 days or something was really embarrassing to Washington. Why is it that people assume this is going to take months and then it ends up taking 12 days? How does a state which has existed for years, I suppose in both of those instances, just collapse like that?
Well, I suppose a couple of things. One is that whole process of conflict from 2011 up to the present day, there's a shift for the state. I mean, all states, including democratic states, rule for a mixture of coercion and consent. Dictatorships rule for a mixture of coercion and consent, including coercion. If they provide security, if they provide a decent standard of living, it's that together with torture and repression that allows a state to survive. Now, over the course of a 14-year civil war, being cut off from the international community, trade sanctions, etc., I mean, this impoverished the Syrian state, it impoverished Syria as a country. It reduced the regime's ability to provide for the people. And you can see how that would erode loyalty. Also, coercion became not only rounding up dissidents and torturing them, locking them up, but bombing whole cities, reducing the country to a wasteland, effectively. So you can see how, at the end of that process, not only has the Syrian regime lost its external backers, but also its ability to rule on the basis of some form of legitimacy. It's less likely that ordinary people on the ground are going to say, we don't like this regime, but at least it provides us with security, or we don't like this regime, but at least we have a decent life. There would have been very few people left in Syria who were enthusiastic supporters of the regime, as opposed to people who acquiesced. And at that point, all it perhaps takes is a prod by sustained opposition for the whole thing to collapse. People weren't prepared to fight for the regime. They weren't prepared to stand up for the regime. I suspect something else that might have happened is the rebels have probably reached out to a lot of sections of the military, including just troops in their bases, and said, look, we're going to advance. Now you can fight with us, or you can take off your uniforms, put on your civilian clothes, and just melt back into society. And we won't find you, we won't chase you. We'll call it an amnesty, effectively. So things like that can have an effect as well. It certainly looks as though some deals were done in order for the regime to implode so quickly and relatively bloodlessly.
Let's talk about the lead rebel, al-Jilani. He's currently presenting himself as relatively moderate. He's saying he'll protect minority rights. He's sort of suggesting, it will be Islamist, but it won't be the kind of Islamist rule you've seen before. But HTS is undeniably an Islamist group, and Jilani has been associated with both Al-Qaeda and ISIS, not two groups you really want to be, have on your CV. That's, of course, why Jilani is designated as a terrorist by the US and Europe, although that could change soon, as we'll talk about later on the show. Last Friday, though, Jilani explained to CNN why people shouldn't hold his associations against him.
I say to people, don't judge by words, but by actions. I believe the reality speaks for itself. These classifications are primarily political and at the same time wrong. I define a terrorist as someone who intentionally kills civilians, harms innocents, or displaces people. If we're being honest, many of the wars waged by major powers in Arab, Muslim, and even non-Muslim countries have involved the deliberate killing of thousands, the destruction of homes, and the displacement of millions. Even the regime itself is guilty of such actions.
But the US and others would say is that you were parts of groups that did exactly that.
Personally, I have not done these things. The situation must be understood in its historical context. There was a massive war in Iraq that deeply stirred people's emotions, prompting many to go there. The circumstances of that war led people to various places, and my path led me to one of those locations. Given my level of awareness and my young age at the time, my actions evolved to where I am today. I didn't go to Iraq with those intentions. I went to defend the Iraqi people. When I returned to Syria, I didn't want to bring what happened in Iraq into Syria. That's why there were disagreements between us and ISIS.
So there were some disagreements between us and ISIS. It's distancing himself somewhat. It's not exactly reassuring, is it?
I mean, it's plausible up to a point. When you think about, I would love to read a biography of this guy. Someone should write a book about him if they haven't already, because, his story really tells the story of not just the last 20 years in the Middle East, but really the last few decades. His dad and his granddad, I think, as well, were involved in, paramilitary groups as Arab nationalists, whereas he's taken the more sort of religious fundamentalist route, which mirrors the kind of shift from Arab nationalism to religious fundamentalism over the last sort of 20, 30 years in terms of, people and groups that oppose the West's involvement in the Middle East and the rule of dictatorial regimes as well. In terms of his route through these various paramilitary groups in Iraq and in Syria. Again, it kind of, it mirrors the way these groups have evolved. It mirrors the different trends. There has been debate amongst these various paramilitary groups and people involved with them as to, what's the best form of quote unquote resistance. To what extent is killing civilians a good idea or a bad idea, not just morally, but strategically? To what extent should we be enforcing religious fundamentalist rule and, social practices on the populations when we take control of territory at the level of pragmatism? And these debates have gone on within groups like Al-Qaeda. This guy strikes me as a pragmatist, and I'm not saying this as a value judgment. I don't share his politics and, all this stuff about not, persecuting civilians. It's just not true. When you look at UN reports about what life's like under HTS in Syria, it is repressive. People are rounded up for dissent, for exercising their freedom of expression, and they are tortured and so on and so forth. But the point I'm making is this guy doesn't seem to be so much of a fanatic that he takes actions which are, which come back and hurt him. He seems to be, savvy enough to realise that he needs to present this kind of face to the wider world, to the wider population in Syria, in order to gain a degree of legitimacy, in order to reduce the likelihood of resistance to his rule, resistance to his advancement. So he's, a fundamentalist, a violent guy, and he's a smart guy as well, a pragmatic guy. And that could smooth his rise to wherever he ends up next. I suspect he'll play a big role in Syria in the next few months and years.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my concern is, I mean, obviously, I'm not saying everyone has concerns, right? I'm not saying maybe you should have some concerns, David. Obviously, you have them. But when you looked at sort of what happened with the Taliban, it seemed to me that, when they said we've moderated, we're going to be nice to women, it wasn't just that they were, misleading the world, but they were almost, it was mutually beneficial for everyone to pretend they were serious, right? Because it was very embarrassing for the Americans that the Taliban had taken over. So it was helpful for the Americans to say, oh, maybe they have changed. It was helpful for, everyone sort of colluded to say maybe they've changed. And then when the world's attention was off, obviously they started massively oppressing women, and America by that point could sort of say, oh yeah, we were lied to, who cares, whatever. And I feel like the fact that he's giving a moderate image to the world, I'm not sure how much we should read into it. I don't know if maybe that means he's pragmatic to the extent that he knows what to say to the world media, but I'm not convinced that that means that he's pragmatic in any kind of way that would, necessarily be a reprieve for the Syrian people once the world's video cameras have left the country. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, the Taliban is the obvious precedent when they were making all these sort of, nice statements before they took back over Afghanistan. And I mean, saying I've reformed or we've reformed is a standard line for authoritarians who want to curry favour with the outside world. And it's not just the Taliban and now HTS. Saudi Arabia says this all the time. And Saudi Arabia's supporters say this all the time. Bashar Al Assad, when he came to power after the death of his father in, I think it was 2000, he came in saying that he would be a reformer. So it's a classic line. I think the extent to which it matters is, from his point of view, he's going to be ruling or involved in the rule of an extremely diverse society and in Syria. And it does make sense, if he wants the country to be stable, for him to not behave as ISIS would. And again, we're talking about a spectrum that involves Al Qaeda and ISIS and groups like that. So it's not a particularly broad spectrum, but it is a spectrum. If your approach is going to be, we're just going to kill everyone who doesn't subscribe to our version of Islam, as ISIS did, then the roof caved in on ISIS's head, and ISIS was got rid of precisely. They didn't last long, precisely because they took that approach. This guy's approach may be highly repressive, but he will also be thinking about the benefits for him in at least being seen to be tolerant of Syria's, diverse communities. And Syria is a very diverse place, and it was part of the reason for the way the war sort of unfolded was the divisions in Syria along the lines of sect, of class, of ethnicity. So a pragmatic ruler would handle those differences with care, and we'll see how pragmatic he is versus how ideological he is in the next few months and years, I suspect.
Yeah, I feel like there's maybe another possible comparison there with Afghanistan, right? Because obviously what the Taliban before the American invasion were very extreme in terms of sort of their repressiveness. But their big mistake was harboring Al Qaeda, who then declared war on America, right? And that was the end of the Taliban. And so the reformed Taliban, to me, now they're back in power, seem like socially they're just as extreme, but they've realized maybe we shouldn't declare a war on America again or harbor, terrorists who declare war on America. I feel like, Jelani, maybe the thing he learned from ISIS is don't declare war on the West, and you can kind of get away with all the Islamist repressive stuff so long as you don't sort of shout about how you're exporting terrorists to bomb all of these Western nations who can then come and defeat you militarily. So I feel like that could also be going on here, but I'm not in any way an expert on this. I want to take a step back actually and look at Assad. They've been in power, well, the dynasty has been in power for 50 years, and sort of look at their politics, what their fall means for the region. Because you sort of implied it earlier, but as far as I understand it, the politics of the Assads, similar to sort of Saddam Hussein, they're Baathists. They were to some degree secular, nationalist, dictatorships, of course. And they seem to be being replaced by something which is more Islamist. What does that tell us about the Middle East? And I suppose, is that sort of model of secular authoritarian dictatorships, is that gone now? That seems like that was a model of governance for a while in the Middle East, and they seem to have sort of fallen one by one.
Yeah, I mean, it's not gone completely. Obviously, you've got the regime in Egypt, which is a descendant of the sort of archetypal Arab nationalist government of Nasser in the 60s, the 50s and 60s, but a very different beast now. The sort of relatively new dictatorship in Tunisia is kind of secular. In terms of secular nationalist and presenting itself as anti-imperialist, I guess it's the last of those. But again, I mean, the Syrian regime, not completely the same as the Egyptian regime, but opportunism and self-interest in both cases really overtook ideological and political commitments to national liberation, to resisting imperialism, etc., etc. I mean, the Syrian regime presented itself as part of some great axis of resistance to Western imperialism, but they were clearly fine with Russian imperialism. And they colluded with the West as well quite often. In the Gulf War in 1991, wasn't it? The Syrians came in against Saddam Hussein on the side of the Americans as part of that great coalition. They were happy to be subcontractors to the George W. Bush regime in the war on terror. He would outsource torture to them. It was one of the destinations for his rendition program. The Assad regime intervened in Lebanon in the 1970s to crush the Lebanese left, with a nod and the wink from Henry Kissinger. So, I mean, all the sort of nice talk that you heard from the Baathists across the Middle East in the 50s and 60s about national liberation, anti-imperialism, etc., it really descended into a quite squalid reality when it came to the Baathist regimes in Iraq and Syria in more recent decades, which were, as I say, self-interested, cynical. So that dream died a long time ago, and this is just the kind of, the rotting corpse of it being toppled over at last.
David, in the second part of the show, we're going to go through the international relations of all of this, what the fall of Assad means for Israel, America, the UK, Russia, Iran, etc. We're about to go to an interview with a Syrian academic in the UK. Before we do that, you're watching Novara Media. As you know, this show is only possible because of your kind support. This whole organisation, the vast majority of our money comes from your donations. I think the average is about £8. So we're very much a grassroots funded organisation. If you are already a donor, thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. If not, please do go to novaramedia.com/support. Our standard ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, but whatever you can afford, whatever you feel able to give us every month, we really, really do appreciate it. It is what makes all of this possible. The Syrian civil war has led to 6.7 million people fleeing the country. And there are large Syrian refugee populations currently living in Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. The vast majority of Syrian refugees are in the region. European countries, though, have also taken on many Syrian refugees, chief among them Germany. Unsurprisingly, significant groups of these displaced people have greeted Assad's fall with joy. In Istanbul, hundreds of Syrians gathered on the weekend to celebrate the end of the Assad dynasty. And there were also gatherings in Beirut, Berlin, Madrid, Paris, London, and Manchester. Earlier today, I spoke to a Syrian living in Britain, Amar Azouz, to find out how he was viewing Assad's fall. Amar Azouz moved to the UK in 2011 to study and is now a research fellow at the University of Oxford. In 2023, he published the book Domicide, Architecture, War, and the Destruction of Home in Syria. I started by asking Amar how he responded to the weekend's news from his home country.
It was in a weekend. At that time, Saturday evening, we heard the news that Homs is going to fall on that evening, and then things kept moving forward, and suddenly we heard that it's all coming into Damascus. And then in the night, I couldn't sleep, so I just stayed awake until 6 a.m. on that day, and we heard that the regime has fallen. So I feel there was a volcano of emotions. I was remembering everything that happened in the last 13 years, and the memory has been just flashing from the forced displacement to the killing of the people to the torture. And there were tears of joy and there were tears of sadness and sorrow of everything we have went through.
And can you talk about the past 13 years for you, I suppose? I know you left Syria in 2011. You haven't been able to return since. I suppose the civil war lasted a lot longer than anyone was sort of initially expecting it to. What has that period been like for you?
So I came to the UK in November 2011. It was 6 months into the start of the revolution. In Homs, already protests were sweeping across the city. People were already being killed by the regime or imprisoned. And for me, the purpose of my movement was primarily education. So I came from my studies here to do my master's and my PhD. And every year I would think that the war would end and next year would be the year that I would return to my country. But I never returned since 2011. And looking back in time, I feel exile has been a damaging and destructive experience because for people who are far away from their homeland, the memory always comes back to them. One would yearn for the city that they left behind and for the people that we left, like family members, relatives, friends, all this infrastructure of support that you no longer have when you arrive to a host country. And you have to not only start from scratch, but I would imagine even from below scratch to build a new life in a new place. So despite the fact that I speak about exile as a painful experience, as an experience of forced displacement, but also exile has a pleasure as well. There are pleasures of exile, and this includes meeting people from all around the world and being introduced to a new culture, but also trying to find a second home. So it was a mixed experience from yearning to a homeland, but also at the same time trying to build a new life in exile.
It's very clear from the way sort of you're speaking and your facial expression that you're relieved and sort of joyous that Assad has gone, has fled, is no longer leader of Syria. Is that mainly because of what's happened over the past 13 years, or sort of before the civil war started? Were you already someone who was very much sort of opposed to Assad?
I mean, we lived in a place where fear was everywhere. People are afraid from each other because there was a sense of that people would report each other if they speak about politics. And therefore, if people are engaged politically, they will be imprisoned or tortured or forcibly disappeared. And we lived in almost like a kingdom of fear, that this kingdom felt very brutal and violent and oppressive for decades. And therefore, nobody dared to speak or to express their mind. We didn't have political parties that they can engage with the local communities and tell us what are our opinions about politics. So it was a long time before the war started that this violence was manifesting itself in many different forms, from silencing political opponents to even arresting young people such as Talal al-Malouhi, who was imprisoned before the war for writing, for being a blogger at the time.
You've written a book, Domicide, Architecture, War and the Destruction of Home in Syria. Can you sort of explain the idea there and sort of why you decided to focus on that topic?
So in any war we are witnessing around the world, from Palestine to Ukraine, from Sudan to Syria, and before the many other countries and cities, we often hear about collateral damage. And therefore we see buildings being destroyed, neighborhoods being erased to the ground. But what we are trying to make as scholars in this research field is to say that architecture is not on the side of the battlefield, but it's at the heart of the battlefield. And therefore, what we have seen in the last 13 years in Syria, that villages, cities, the built environment has been deliberately destroyed not because it was part of the collateral damage, but because of the intention to collectively punish people. So in that sense, architecture becomes weaponized as a way to destroy a sense of community, a sense of identity and belonging, to displace people, to make it impossible for them to live in that area. But even when people would return, they return to the ruins of their homelands. So in my book, Domicide, I try to unpack what it means to lose one's home, and what are the consequences for people who see their home being destroyed, but also what does home mean for people when they are displaced. So even when millions of refugees are displaced, and in Syria there are more than 6.5 million Syrians scattered around the world, destruction from afar also causes a huge sense of grief and misery that one sees their own homeland being destroyed from far away.
And are you worried about what comes next? I mean, I suppose we have sort of a number of examples now where a sort of reprehensible, oppressive dictator falls, and things don't necessarily get much better. So I suppose Iraq or Libya being fairly obvious examples. Do you fear what could happen next in Syria?
I think at this very moment, there is a huge sense of hope that this kingdom of fear has collapsed. And there is joy and celebration that people can return to their country after years, and some people even who were forcibly displaced before the war started because of their political opinions. Now there's this sense of hope and joy that the question of return, the idea of return, is possible. We are also, like, around the world, we are seeing that prisoners are freed now after living for years and years at the time of horrors inside these prisons. And therefore, at this moment, it's a moment of joy that these people are reunited with their families and friends and loved ones. The question of tomorrow is, of course, very difficult and painful. Everyone wants to have stability and peace in the country. At the moment, there are many uncertainties on what the future would look like. And there are, of course, fears and anxieties about the future. But for today, it's just a moment for us to breathe and remember what happened, try to celebrate the release, the freedom of the innocent lives that have been imprisoned for years. And the question of tomorrow would come soon, to think about what next look like and how can we transfer into a democratic space. And that would need, it seems like a long road to go, but we're just starting it.
And on that question of return, I mean, it's become a sort of talking point in British media and the Western media, I think, I suppose in part because refugees have become a bit political football. So I think Germany have already sort of stopped processing Syrian claims because they say, well, Assad is gone, so it's not necessarily a dangerous place. Now, to me, Syria still looks like a fairly dangerous place because it's so uncertain. At the same time, it does seem like some people are already going back to Syria. What's sort of your take on this? I mean, to me, if I was a Syrian refugee, I'd feel fairly scared to go back now because it's such an unstable situation. But sort of where do you stand on this?
I think the question of return is very important. And as I said, more than half of the population has been displaced. So not only outside the country, in neighboring countries such as Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and beyond, but also the internally displaced people. There are more than 6.5 million Syrians who are displaced inside the country. And reports have shown us that some people have been displaced internally more than 25 times, because every time the conflict front lines shift or their circumstances change. So many people have left, but their cities and towns and homes have not left them. So the question of return is essential today. And of course, this would be dependent on the day after, and how does tomorrow look like if there is a democratic and a genuine political transformation that ensures that people's lives would be protected and their rights would be protected. then the return, we would see many people returning. But even now, in the last week or so, we have seen people going back to their homes if they are displaced inside the country, such as to Idlib. So they have started returning to Aleppo after years of forced displacement. But also we have seen people returning from Lebanon and from Turkey. So I think we have to understand that the ache and the pain of displacement is enormous, and many people would return for many different reasons, to live there or maybe to visit. But I think as long as it's as long as it is a return by their own will, that would be like the welcome idea of return, but not against people's will.
That was Amar Azuz speaking to me earlier today. In that interview, I mentioned that Germany had paused processing claims of Syrians seeking asylum. The UK have now joined that move. They've also paused claims for Syrians seeking asylum. Now, in a way, there would be a benevolent reading of this, which is to say it's very difficult to judge a claim when the situation is so in flux. So if it were the case that, okay, we'll look again at this in a year, but until then you can get on with your life, that would be okay. Of course, people who are seeking asylum can't work. They've got no recourse to public funds. It's a terrible situation to be in. So if you're extending that limbo period, then it starts to seem a bit more malicious. Assad's fall was precipitated by a shift in the balance of international forces. His most important ally, Russia, was distracted in Ukraine, and his local allies, Iran and Hezbollah, had both been weakened by Israel. And Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, was quick to celebrate Assad's demise.
This is a historic day for the Middle East. The collapse of the Assad regime, the tyranny in Damascus, offers great opportunity, but also is fraught with significant dangers. This collapse is a direct result of our forceful action against Hezbollah and Iran, Assad's main supporters. It set off a chain reaction of all those who want to free themselves from this tyranny and its oppression. But it also means we have to take action against possible threats. One of them is the collapse of the Separation of Forces Agreement from 1974 between Israel and Syria. This agreement held for 50 years. Last night it collapsed. The Syrian army abandoned its positions. We gave the Israeli army the order to take over these positions to ensure that no hostile force embeds itself right next to the border of Israel. This is a temporary defensive position until a suitable arrangement is found.
That was Netanyahu bragging about his role in the fall of Assad and justifying, or attempting to justify, Israel furthering its military occupation of Syrian territory. So the intervention over the past 24 hours or so has been dramatic. Israel has occupied a UN buffer zone, which has separated the illegally annexed Golan Heights from the rest of Syria since the disengagement agreement was brokered in 1974. Israel has also occupied areas beyond that buffer zone, and that has led to a furious reaction from Egypt, who have condemned the movement of tanks and infantry into Syria, and they say in the strongest possible terms, and Egypt say it amounted to the occupation of Syrian land and a severe breach of the 1974 armistice deal. Israel's assault has also gone even further beyond this border area. So since Saturday, Israel has bombed dozens of locations in Syria, including a site in Damascus said to have been used for rocket development by Iranian scientists. Israel has also said it has bombed chemical weapons stores, they say, to keep them out of the hands of extremists. David, obviously Israel's actions, in a very direct way, seem to, I suppose, indirect. I don't know if they wanted Assad to fall. We can talk about that as well. But their attacks on Hezbollah clearly facilitated his fall. Are they sort of taking advantage of Syrian weakness by now just grabbing more land? What do you see going on here?
Yeah, it's kind of an opportunistic approach to something that, they did play a role, certainly, in the weakening of the international support that was propping up the Assad regime, and therefore they played a role in precipitating Assad's fall. I don't know if they necessarily predicted that the regime would fall, though. But now that it has, they're being quite opportunistic about things, grabbing this additional bit of territory. We'll see if they want to, keep it or not. They certainly want to keep the Golan Heights. Whether they want to keep this as well, I guess we'll find out. And they want to make sure as well that Syria, whatever Syria emerges, out of this process will be as weak as possible, including as militarily weak as possible. Some reports I was reading a few moments before we came on air about the Israelis trying to hit Syria's what remains of the Syrian Air Force. So, yeah, I mean, you would expect this from the Israelis, I guess. And it does kind of underline what a miscalculation strategically Hamas made on October the 7th. I mean, their goal, it seems, was to flip the table, basically, and say, we're so desperate, we're going to try and change the situation with a dramatic action, and kind of hoping that, you know, the various allies, as part of this quote-unquote axis of resistance that Iran's at the heart of, would come to their aid. And instead, the response that was entirely predictable, if you take an action like that, from the Israelis, has been devastating. Not only in Gaza, where it's been genocidal, the Israeli actions there, but Hamas has lost their ally in Hezbollah has been severely weakened when Hezbollah tried to come to Hamas's aid. And notwithstanding the fact that Hamas didn't like the Assad regime, and Hamas has put out this statement today saying that they welcome the fall of the Assad regime. The fact is, the Assad regime was part of this wider network, and Iran's ability to supply Hezbollah through Syria was of strategic benefit to Hamas as well. So it just underlines the extent to which, you know, aside from whatever else you might say about the attacks on October the 7th, militarily, they've been a grotesque failure from Hamas's point of view. It's been a huge strategic miscalculation, and they're much weaker as a result of everything that's happened since then.
Interesting. I was going to ask that because obviously, you know, when we talk about the axis of resistance, or as you said, so-called axis of resistance, it included Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, Iran, and then the Houthis. So I suppose, you know, on paper, the fact that Assad has fallen means that Syria is no longer part of the axis of resistance. But as far as I understood, you know, Syria was never in a position to sort of, well, not in recent history, in a position to threaten Israel. I mean, because Assad has been incredibly weak. So is that the main reason why this could be strategically useful for Israel? Because, as you say, weapons were being supplied to Hezbollah by Iran via Syria. Was it mainly just a sort of this thoroughfare that it served a role in the axis of resistance?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps it's a little more than a thoroughfare, but certainly the Assad regime was not a direct threat to Israel. It was a conservative regime in lots of ways, you know, including in the sense that it prioritized its own survival over any kind of, you know, principled quote-unquote resistance. It prioritized its own survival. But it did have a role within this quote-unquote axis of resistance with Iran at the center. It did have a role as part of that in facilitating the maintenance of Hezbollah as a major force on the northern border of Israel. And that was its value to Iran. And it was Iranian support which kept the regime propped up, certainly in the earliest days of the Syrian civil war. Yeah, I mean, this is a huge change, the fall of this regime. It really, really impacts on the geopolitics of the region massively. I mean, the Hamas kind of angle is one angle. In terms of Iran's geopolitical strength in the region, Iran's whole strategic approach to the fact that it's a relatively isolated regime, geopolitically speaking, within the region, which was to build up this kind of forward defense, as it would describe it, and cultivating these paramilitary groups in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Palestine, and also supporting the Syrian regime. I mean, this is falling apart in really significant ways as a result of not just what's been happening since October the 7th, but for other reasons as well. So, again, I don't want to make predictions about how this is going to play out, but we can say that it's significant, definitely.
And if we were to talk about, you know, the main driver or the main international driver of what's happened, because people are, you know, understandably, I don't think it's unreasonable to sort of say who are the international actors that are not just indirectly affecting events, but sort of, you know, to some extent driving them. Is the main candidate Turkey? Is it sort of Turkey? If you're going to point to a country that seems to be, actively facilitating HTS toppling Assad, is Turkey the place to look?
Yeah, it seems to be. I mean, I'm not getting a huge sense that many regional actors were particularly keen on the fall of the regime. I mean, if anything, the regime was being reintegrated into the sort of state system. You know, the likes of the Emiratis and even the Saudis were kind of tentatively reaching out to them. They took the view that the regime was going to survive, and they saw the regime for whatever other faults it may have had, to put it mildly, as a kind of bulwark against groups like HTS. Even the Israelis won't be, for all that Netanyahu is bragging in the clip you showed earlier, they won't be 100% comfortable with HTS living on their border. They won't be comfortable with, HTS led by this guy Al-Jilani, not named after the Golan Heights, where he says his family came from. Al-Jilani, who has said that the thing that radicalized him initially as a young man was Israel's response to the Second Palestinian Intifada. So the Israelis won't be that happy about what's happened. It seems to me that only Turkey were particularly behind this move, only particularly kind of keen and enthusiastic for these developments to take place. Aside from the Iranians, obviously, and Hezbollah, who wanted the regime to survive, there were lots of other actors who didn't like the regime but preferred the regime to the alternatives. Probably even the Americans, if push comes to shove. They didn't like the regime at all, but they probably preferred it to chaos, which they worried would be the outcome if the regime did fall. So Turkey have got what they wanted. And others, I guess, will be on the one hand celebrating that the regime's fallen because they didn't like the regime, but on the other hand, perhaps more quietly, they'll be a bit worried about whatever's going to happen next.
And I suppose to understand why the Turks are involved, I suppose my interpretation is it seems like because Syria is quite weak, it wasn't really an existential threat to anyone at this point. I mean, the Syrian people, of course, Assad's regime was, but sort of to anyone in the region anymore. But the Turks saw the possibility of a Kurdish independent state as an existential threat to them. So even though Assad himself was no threat to Turkey, they, wanted to shake up the snow globe, so it were, before it became normalized that there was this Kurdish region. Obviously, the Kurds are going to be, very apprehensive about what happens next. Hopefully, they'll be able to come to some kind of deal with Gilani and sort of keep their autonomous or relatively autonomous zone. Let's look at responses from some countries further afield. This was Joe Biden.
At long last, the Assad regime has fallen. This regime brutalized and tortured and killed literally hundreds of thousands of innocent Syrians. The fall of the regime is a fundamental act of justice. It's a moment of historic opportunity for the long-suffering people of Syria to build a better future for their proud country. It's also a moment of risk and uncertainty. As we all turn to the question of what comes next, the United States will work with our partners and the stakeholders in Syria to help them seize an opportunity to manage the risks. For years, the main backers of Assad have been Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. But over the last week, their support collapsed, all three of them, because all three of them are far weaker today than they were when I took office. And let's remember why. After Hamas attacked Israel on October the 7th, 2023, when much of the world responded with horror, Iran and its proxies chose to launch a multi-front war against Israel.
That was a curiously orange Joe Biden. He seems to be sort of copying Donald Trump's complexion before he leaves office. Of course, Biden is now yesterday's man. From January, it will be Donald Trump in the White House. He has this rather long tweet. Opposition fighters in Syria, an unprecedented move, have totally taken over numerous cities in a highly coordinated offensive and are now on the outskirts of Damascus, obviously preparing to make a very big move toward taking out Assad. Russia, because they are so tied up in Ukraine, and with the loss there of over 600,000 soldiers, seem incapable of stopping this literal march through Syria, a country they have protected for years. This is where former President Obama refused to honor his commitment of protecting the red line in the sand, and all hell broke out with Russia stepping in. But now they are, like possibly Assad himself, being forced out, and it may actually be the best thing that can happen to them. There was never much of a benefit in Syria for Russia, other than to make Obama look really stupid. In any event, Syria is a mess, but is not our friend. And this is all in caps. The United States should have nothing to do with it. This is not our fight. Let it play out. Do not get involved. David, I mean, some people might be reassured by that tweet from Donald Trump. He's saying, the one thing I'm saying is the US should not be getting involved here.
Yeah, and perhaps he means that. I mean, it's hard to tell with him. It's so difficult to predict. He's such a volatile character. And I mean, one thing, just looking at the text of that tweet, when he says that Russia doesn't have any serious interest in Syria, I mean, it's just indicative of the fact that the guy hasn't got a clue what he's talking about on so many issues, including this one. Syria is absolutely vital to Russia. At least it's vital to, Putin's kind of, revanchist imperialist foreign policy. As we've mentioned before, the naval base at Tartus, the air base at Latakia, it's a crucial strategic asset for Russia, and Russia will continue to try and pursue that investment. Apparently, they're already in talks with the new authorities in Damascus to try and keep that. I guess Trump will be thinking about to what extent can these developments impact on Ukraine. He's going to try and broker a deal in Ukraine, and perhaps believes that he's in a stronger position to do that with Russia being weaker. But yeah, I mean, I just find it hard to analyse the guy based on these whatever garbage he comes out with at any given point. We'll find out when he takes office what his real plans are, and what the plans of the people who will be running his government for him are, which is probably more important.
And let's end on the country that probably isn't a particularly key player in the region, but is obviously very close to home. Pat McFadden is Starmer's closest ally in Parliament. He was doing the media rounds this morning.
This rebel group, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, known as HTS, it is a proscribed organisation here in the UK. Will you have to look at that again now?
Yeah, we will. And we'll consider that. And I think it will partly depend on what happens in terms of how that group behaves now. But I think countries around the world who prescribe this, it's not just the UK, the United States, European countries as well, I think probably will look at that now and see what's going to happen in the future. But we've not made any decisions on that over the weekend.
And how long will it take for you to make a decision?
Well, it won't take that long. I think we'll need to do it quite quickly.
The United States, we know, has bombed some targets inside Syria over the last 24 hours. Israel has done the same. Where does that leave the UK? Do you fully support the action that they have been taking?
What I think Israel's doing is making sure its position in the Golan is secure. One of the things to note about this has partly happened because of Israeli action against Iranian proxies around the region, and that has left Iran weakened, and that is partly why the Assad regime has fallen. So the action that Israel has taken over the last few days will be to make sure that its position in the Golan is secure.
So that's supported by the UK?
We will always support Israel's right to defend itself and make itself secure.
So he says, we'll always defend Israel's right to defend itself and make itself secure in reference to the Golan Heights. Now, the Golan Heights are not part of Israel, right? According to international law, they're part of Syria. That's an illegal occupation. And now suddenly it's not just Israel has a right to defend itself, it's Israel has a right to defend the territories it has illegally annexed, right? It's completely bizarre. Well, not bizarre because it's very predictable. We know why he's doing this. I suppose comment on that, David, and then also this idea that HTS were a terrorist organisation. Now they've taken over the country, we'll actually cross them off that list. I mean, how should we think about that?
I mean, it's a standard story. If a country or a group is prepared to orient itself towards the West, then that defines how we characterise them in moral terms, If they're on our side, then by definition they're good guys. If they're not on our side, then by definition they're the bad guys, irrespective of who they are and how they behave. And in terms of Israel, Israel's a great example of that. Israel's oriented towards Western power, so Israel can literally do what it likes, including genocide. And in terms of the Golan and beyond, the way you put it is quite right. There's no self-defense of illegally occupied territory. That's a contradiction in terms. And there's no legitimate self-defense that involves taking other people's territory, occupying another country's territory. Israel's got, the right to defend itself within its own borders and according to international law, and this is why this invocation of Israel's right to self-defense is so fatuous in so many contexts, precisely because it pays no mind to international law, occupies other people's territories, commits war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, etc. The use of self-defense in terms of Israel's behaviour is just becoming a bit of a sick joke at this point. But I guess the British government is still lacking the shame necessary to preclude using terms like that in contexts like this.
And let's close on some, I suppose, mild speculation. The past 13 years in Syria have been an absolute disaster. A sort of a revolt becomes a civil war, which becomes a proxy war. As we sort of heard earlier, sort of 7 million people flee the country, hundreds of thousands killed, millions internally displaced. Is there, what do you think are the risks that we just see that all over again? Sort of like there's these initial hopes that Jelani might sort of try and bring people together and moderate it, but then actually some factions can't really get on board. Some of the people who are in, Assad's military lose their jobs and now want to join a different military faction. And then even though, it seems at the moment that there aren't that many sort of international forces that see a vital interest in Syria, sort of some of them sort of start to say, oh, maybe we do have an interest in this. How likely do you think it is that sort of we just see a rerun of the Syrian civil war now? Or do you think it is more likely that this is over?
I hate speculating, and I hate trying to predict things because, you spend enough time following international relations and you learn that, attempts to make predictions will make a mug out of you sooner or later. I mean, I think we've focused a lot over the past hour on, the objectively negative aspects and concerning aspects about HTS, and we've focused a lot on the dangers. I mean, the interview you had with the young Syrian guy, I think it is a really worthwhile balance to that. I mean, the reason that so many Syrians are so delighted at this moment is because they at least see some hope, I mean, under the Assad regime, there was none. And now there's some. I think people in Syria are well aware of the dangers of HTS and the Syrian National Army, this group aligned with them. But, at the same time, the anti-Assad forces were never reducible to, foreign jihadis, Islamic fundamentalists. There was a wide range of people who despised the regime for good reason. And, HTS up till now has only controlled a small pocket of territory in the northwest. I am very sceptical about its ability to impose its will on the entirety of Syria, which is a large country, by the way, and a large and populous country. I'd be surprised if it could go from dominating, a population of a couple of million to dominating a country of, I guess it's like 16, 17 million at this point. And so you wonder what could happen next. I mean, there are many different forces in Syrian civil society, and there's a popular appetite for a different future. So, we're aware, I think, everyone here and, in the outside world and in Syria of the dangers, but we shouldn't rule out the possibility that Syria does have a brighter future. It's going to be very painful and very rocky, but it could turn out well as well, and I think we should at least let the Syrian people have their moment, because they certainly deserve it after 50 years of this horrific regime. And we'll see what comes next. And let's not rule out the possibility that it doesn't turn ugly. That could well happen, but it's not the only potential scenario that we're facing, that Syria's facing.
Yeah, I mean, I think give people their moment who are celebrating the fall of the Assad regime after decades of oppression. I mean, I think that's difficult to disagree with. And of course, we'll be covering this story throughout the week. We'll be getting loads of great guests on. David Waring, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been really, really useful, insightful analysis from you.
Happy to do it.
And thank you everyone for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.